From Hamilton Place Strategies in Washington, D.C., this is the HPS Insights podcast.
Welcome to HPS Insights, a podcast from Hamilton Place Strategies analyzing the current events impacting the business and political communities. I'm your host, Brian DeAngelis, a managing director here at HPS, and today I am joined by two of our partners for our second episode on the 2020 debates. Michael Steele is back and making his HPS Insights debut, Tucker Warren. Gentlemen, thanks for joining me.
Good to be with you.
Thank you, Brian.
We're going to discuss mostly last night's vice presidential debate. I'll take a liberty of having one rule, which is to keep your fly jokes to a minimum this morning. But news is already changing. I do want to call out the president did an interview this morning on Fox Business News, going after vice presidential candidate Harris pretty hard, calling her a monster. There's also been a lot of news this morning around the next presidential debate that's slated for next Thursday between Biden and Trump. The commission has come out unilaterally, from what I understand, to make it a virtual debate with the candidates in two different locations. As of this recording on Thursday morning, it looks like the Trump campaign is going to pass on that opportunity and hold a rally instead, but a lot of moving parts. So we'll jump into a little bit of that. I feel pretty safe not betting real money that we'll have four debates, but we're 2 for 2. So let's talk about what happened last night. So I want to start same way we did last week with Steele and our other partner, Stacey Kerr. How much do these debates matter at all for voters?
Well, I mean, I think that, look, actuarially speaking, both of the vice presidential nominees have a greater likelihood of being president of the United States than usual. I think that in a race that has been very, very steady for the past year, these are opportunities to have an inflection point, opportunities for things to change in a substantive way with a lot of eyeballs on the screens. But I think the news this morning from the president is a reminder that ultimately people vote for the top of the ticket. And so a vice presidential debate may point the way to the future. It may be an indicator of where the parties are going in 2024. It may feel like a sort of refreshing throwback in some ways, but it doesn't ultimately change the course of the presidential race.
Tucker, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, obviously we have two candidates here that are 74 and 77 respectively. I think Democrats were likely watching last night to see how Kamala Harris performed. I mean, Democrats had a chance to see her perform in an environment in the primaries where she had to stack performances back to back to back, and this was an opportunity for her to use what I think is probably a substantial amount of information and evidence to prosecute the case against the administration's handling on things like COVID, and I think that was an important thing for people to see her in that light, and that she could be a suitable successor to Biden, and I think she held her own.
Great, and I do have to say this was a bit refreshing. It felt like an old school debate. You may not agree with what each candidate said. There was certainly a lot of vigorous debate back and forth, but that's what these debates are supposed to be, a clash of ideas and partisan, policy positions. They're both excellent debaters, and if you all disagree, I'd love to hear it. But talk a little bit about your expectations or the expectations that the campaign set for each other going into last night's debate.
Tucker, why don't you start with that one?
I mean, I think let's start with the polls. So, I mean, this week, CNN came out with a poll that showed Biden at 57% of the vote. That seems high. And you'd have to be mindful of the fact that in mid-October of 2016, polling showed Clinton with a 14-point lead over Trump. I think the fundamentals of this race in 2020 are a bit different. They've been more stable, and Biden's lead has never been less than 6 points or more than 10 points. So it feels as though this time the polling is more likely to be accurate than not. But I think if you believe the polls, I think what Pence's camp would have wanted last night would have been for him to both do as he's always done and present a softer, kind of kinder, gentler version of the administration. Pence has, in my view, oftentimes served as the bridge between the kind of the disaffected Republican voter that supports the administration's policy positions, but maybe is uncomfortable with the style in which the president goes about it. I think Pence was very effective in doing that last night. He certainly needed, if you believe the polls, he needed to land some shots that created some additional opportunity in future debates for the president. I think Pence did that to some effect. Pence is a very effective debater. He's not easily rattled, and I think he's a very good counterpuncher. And I think last night he had a pretty effective performance and certainly did no harm for the administration. In terms of Harris, she really needed to not do any harm, but of course you're always mindful of, the old football analogy of prevent defense, and what she couldn't do is go out there last night.
Prevents wins.
Yeah. What she couldn't do last night is just go out there and hold serve. She needed to land some punches as well. And I think she did that. We'll talk a little bit about where she did that and whether there was opportunity there that she didn't seize. I think that is the case. But nonetheless, I think did no harm.
I like the tennis boxing combo metaphor at the end there. It's striking to me that this was not so much a clash of ideas as a clash of two different realities. In the world that Mike Pence occupies, President Trump has heroically and successfully led America to peace abroad, prosperity at home, and a successful effort to contain the coronavirus. And Senator Harris lives in a reality where those claims are so preposterous that they don't really need to be engaged with or litigated. And so they weren't so much debating as bouncing off of each other in these two separate spheres. And I thought the vice president, because he was disciplined, because I think he has to go outside of his own bubble and defend the administration, was prepared to do that. Whereas Senator Harris at times just seemed to be unprepared for arguments that the vice president was clearly going to make, right? She may disagree with them. She may think they're ludicrous, but these are things he's been saying for months, and there needed to be some preparation for effective counters to the narrative that he was gonna lay out. And so I think that was a real missed opportunity for the Biden ticket.
Yeah, I expected two things. I expected two things last night. I mean, Mike Pence is the head of the coronavirus task force. You've got 210,000 Americans dead and 2.5 million active cases in America, 34 of which are in the White House, which is more than the country of Taiwan or Liberia. And that includes the president of the United States. I really expected Harris to press that issue repeatedly. And I think she did to some effect, but it almost felt like she delivered what she planned to deliver, but didn't really press the case there as much as I expected. I certainly expected Pence to press Harris's own liberal record and that of the progressive wing of the party. We saw the president do that in the first debate, talking repeatedly about the Green New Deal and packing the courts. And I think we did see Pence do that consistently last night. And in fact, that almost seemed to be his pivot place, where if he didn't have a good answer for something, he just kind of threw back to the Green New Deal and packing the courts.
Right. And fracking. Yeah. And I mean, Pence clearly had a game plan and executed it. And I couldn't tell you what Harris's game plan was other than getting in as many mentions of the Affordable Care Act and pre-existing conditions as possible.
I want to talk for a second about that debate over two realities for these candidates. And that came up, I think, very acutely in the question from Paige about Breonna Taylor. And you heard Harris talk about justice not being served in that case. You saw Pence attack Harris and her record as a prosecutor as not putting more faith in the criminal justice system and the decision of a grand jury. This is a big divide in our country right now, and I want to hear how you all thought that played out. And Tucker, why don't I start with you?
I thought that was a high point for Senator Harris. She, I thought, did a nice job of reflecting on her conversation with the Taylor family, including, Breonna's ambitions to become a nurse. I thought her line where she said, bad cops are bad for good cops was a good, memorable line.
Good line.
And then she had a short list of things that are policy positions of the Biden ticket on banning chokeholds, a national registry, eliminating private prisons, legalizing marijuana, sentence reform. It ended up being a bit of a laundry list of stuff, but I thought it was a moment where Harris delivered empathy, and really kind of drew a distinction, which was further underscored in Pence's response, where he did, of course, reflect his sympathies to the Taylor family, but I thought pretty quickly moved to I trust our justice system. There's no excuse for rioting and looting. And I really thought that Pence could have, in that answer, done a better job of playing on the empathy note before the pivot. And frankly, I think there are a lot of people in this country, not just Democrats, that are questioning whether trusting our justice system is in fact true. We've seen obviously a lot of terrible incidents in this calendar year and years prior, where our system of justice, not just juries and judges, but those that are responsible for executing justice on the streets, doing things that are just unacceptable in this country, and we've seen those tragedies on video. So I thought that was a high point for Harris. I wasn't surprised by ultimately what Pence's position was on it. I was surprised that he was as quick as he was to pivot to I trust our justice system, rather than spending a little more time reflecting on the tragedy the country has seen in this year. And as a result, I think that will win him no additional votes in communities of color.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a reminder of how quickly things have changed this year. Over the summer, I think the competing cries of Black Lives Matter and law and order seemed to be a dominant issue in the campaign, and now it was just one question because the pandemic fallout, economic results, the Supreme Court fight. As for the vice president's response, all I can say is that he handled it better and more responsibly and more sensitively than the president would have, certainly. And I recognize that that's a low bar, but he did clear that.
Right. I do feel like Pence walked into a situation where he had to start on defense. The first two questions from Page were about COVID, and they were worded with, the coronavirus is not under control. There are 210,000 people dead. And he had to start right from there. I did find him, and I'm curious your thoughts, at times almost over-prepared, where he proactively brought up some things that surprised me. He brought up impeachment. He brought up some of the issues around COVID that seemed to put himself on more defense for the administration, and Harris didn't need to do the work for him.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is another example where the realities just don't intersect, where to the administration, the impeachment effort was nothing but a partisan witch hunt by Democrats that wasted time that could have been used to increase American prosperity and security, whereas to Democrats, it's a deep scar and stain on the legacy of this president.
Do you think that works with voters? I'm genuinely curious. You've advised candidates. Would you want to remind people about impeachment, or pretend it didn't happen?
In this context, probably so. I mean, you can't pretend it didn't happen. So describing it in, hanging a lantern on the problem, describing it in the terms that you prefer, I think is probably smart. I also thought, in addition to the COVID attacks from Harris, which weren't, I don't think, as sharp or effective as they should have been, she waited an awfully long time to get to the $750 tax issue for the president. I was amazed it took Joe Biden until halfway through the first debate to mention it. I can't remember if Page prompted her to get onto the topic, or she brought it up on her own. But those two things, having a cogent, sharp attack on the COVID situation that takes into account the narrative that Pence is going to lay out, the China travel ban, therapeutics, ventilators, Operation Warp Speed, and hammering the president on not paying taxes while disparaging American service members, those are your two sledgehammers. And I do not understand why she kind of left them in the toolkit for so long last night.
Yeah, but I think you're right. I haven't seen, and I'm not privy to any kind of additional information from Biden world, but that does not seem to be a top two. It's COVID, it's healthcare, It's sometimes some of the military commander-in-chief stuff, and the taxes, despite it being pretty fresh. I mean, this is a week and a half ago. The New York Times broke this. It doesn't seem to be in their first kind of three punches at the administration.
Well, and Tucker, I appreciate your response to this, because I always feel like the Affordable Care Act, while it is now more popular than not, the argument, there's this lawsuit, and if it succeeds, the Affordable Care Act goes away, and that could lead to a lack of coverage for people with pre-existing conditions. That feels like a few too many jumps for an effective argument to me. Yet Democrats seem quite certain that that is a really a winning issue and a winning argument for them.
I think it feels more like a winning argument to them, given that we're in the middle of a global pandemic. If we weren't, I would question some of the merits of that being issue one. But given that the country is dealing with so many health issues at the moment, there's probably a sharper way to connect the two without going down the rabbit hole of if this, then that, then there's pre-existing conditions. And by the way, we're not going to do away with your private insurer. You'll have two options. I mean, pretty quickly, people's eyes glaze over when you start talking healthcare anyway, if you don't just keep it at the kitchen table level. And, I thought Harris maybe went a little too far on that. My recommendation to the campaign, if they were asking me, would be to keep the healthcare discussion very, very high level, pre-existing conditions being that, plus that you're dealing with a global pandemic. Everyone needs healthcare in a global pandemic. And what you don't want is you don't want a neighbor who doesn't have access to healthcare in a global pandemic, who is walking around potentially contagious, but not having access to getting that checked out. That would be, to me, a very an easy issue to press without having to rely on bank shots to deliver the message.
Yeah, she took a pivot last night, which, correct me if I'm wrong, was the first time I've seen this ticket talk about it this way. Less about what you get with Affordable Care Act and more what they're going to take away. They're coming from you. She had that whole riff. You have pre-existing conditions, they're coming from you. You have this, they're coming for you. How effective do you think that all will be, especially as we see Trump losing voters, college educated women in the suburbs? He seems to be hurting in that family kind of mom community.
Yeah, I thought as a line, it was pretty good. It honestly felt like something Trump would say, whether it's on guns or something else. They're coming for you. They're coming for you. It kind of created
the boogeyman part of it.
Yeah, this image of there's this mob out there that's going to come get something that matters to you. I too didn't expect it. I hadn't heard the campaign use that language when it comes to healthcare. I think she ended up actually getting cut off before she finished it. She delivered it very late in the answer, and then Susan Page ended up calling time, and she had to wrap it up pretty quickly. So I think the line probably wasn't as clean as it otherwise would. I'm not sure how it ultimately landed, but stylistically it was different.
I want to go back to Pence for a second. I did think he had a plan, and he came in with a good VP should do. He prosecuted the other side's record. Knowing what we know, that no one is going to change Trump except Trump, did he lay out any sort of playbook for Trump in the next two debates that could Trump learn something from Pence last night that might work against Biden-Harris?
God, yes, but he won't. I mean, this is the sort of, Pence is the embodiment of what Trump could be with a modicum of additional discipline. This is a cogent, effective case for the Trump administration that the president himself cannot make. And I thought it was a very, very effective argument, frankly, for a Pence primary candidacy in the Republican Party in 2024. And this is the argument that I think he'll make, whether or not the ticket is successful this year. The argument he'll make is that he is the figure that can unite the pro-Trump base of the party with Trump skeptical traditional conservatives and make a defensible, rational, and decent case for the administration's record.
I was unclear if I was going to go there this morning, but I watched a little too much post-debate political punditry on cable news last night, and there was a lot of talk about 2024 on both sides. Knowing that always happens, I didn't see anything overtly focused on 2024. I thought they both did a good job for their candidate. But did you guys see anything different? Did you see positioning or Pence moving past Trump, anything like that?
No, the best way, your job as a vice presidential nominee is to get the president of the United States elected, or your candidate elected president of the United States. And the sort of unstinting loyalty and admiration that the vice president showed for Donald Trump is exactly the right role. I thought Kamala Harris, felt like was still a little bit adjusting to her role as a vice presidential nominee rather than the candidate herself, and seemed to sort of tack on a mention of Joe Biden at the end of answers that were her answers rather than the campaign's answers.
Yeah, I agree with that point. And let's keep in mind, I mean, she ran against Biden and had fundamentally different policy positions than Biden on some things. I mean, Biden needs to continue to try to square the idea that he's got a moderate record of policy in Washington. The party has moved to the left of him, and his team and himself, the candidate, worked with Bernie Sanders and others to develop a policy framework on a number of issues. And so he's continuing to try to maintain daylight between where he is and where the Green New Deal is, for example. But the mere fact that he worked with Sanders and others on environmental policy issues for the future gives the president and Pence a very easy line of attack of saying, well, you might say you're this, but let's judge you by who's surrounding you. And I think that gives opportunity. So I think that in some ways it's both. I mean, Harris herself maybe could have done a better job of bringing Biden in, but I think it's also the construct of how this campaign got to where they are on policies, and the fact that Biden's own record is a bit more moderate than where some of these positions are fleshing out in 2020.
Well, and I thought Pence was very skillful at driving on the fracking issue, the sort of compromise position that will ban fracking on public lands allows him to say ban fracking, and her to say, well, no, we're not going to do that on private lands. The coming to an agreement on something that looks an awful lot like the Green New Deal, but isn't called the Green New Deal on climate change, allowed the vice president to attack very effectively on that. And honestly, I do not understand why the Biden-Harris ticket doesn't have a better answer on the court packing question. That is just, it's obvious, it's right there. The former vice president tripped over it in the first debate, and
even a non-answer, they need something.
Right. It's not an illegitimate question.
I'm with you.
It's not that important to that many people.
I want to know the answer to the question.
Yeah, like just, it could even be a conditional answer that allows you to attack Trump for making a nomination so close to the election. We'll have to look and see what happens with this, illegitimate Trump nomination. There's a way to be able to answer that question that doesn't tie you to any specific course of action and sounds effective, sounds cogent, and they don't have.
Yeah, we teach it to clients. You've got to satisfy the question before you can pivot to a message that's going to work. And I think they need to prepare for that for the next debates.
Can I ask a question? Since Steele, you brought up fracking, and I'm curious, Brian and Steele, both. I'm always surprised when fracking comes up. I mean, it feels like a very narrow issue that continually comes up. I mean, is there a large swath of the country that cares deeply about fracking that I'm unaware of, or is fracking as an issue just kind of a placeholder for environmental activism, and they just use that as the example of where liberals might scale back?
Right?
I would argue that it's a relatively small portion of the country, but it is an extremely politically significant portion of the country. It's that southeastern Ohio, western Pennsylvania, a lot of jobs connected with fracking, and those just, Pennsylvania particularly, is always a swing state, always a toss-up, or always at least trying to make it a toss-up. And so they zero in on that issue.
It is very hot on the left. You did have AOC take to Twitter last night opposing fracking in the middle of the debate, which, so yeah, it's a pretty contentious issue that gets that airtime for that reason. I want to take a break, but before we do, because I want to come back in a second segment and move on a little bit from last night, but I think it's got to be the worst 90-minute job of anybody, but I want your take on how Susan Page did last night. Well-respected journalist. I think she, Pence maybe pushed her around a little bit on the timing stuff. We saw a lot of criticism on Twitter, but what did you guys think of her performance?
I think the moderating job for these things is just, it's a bad job.
Agree.
Kind of an impossible one to win. But what gets frustrating is when they state at the beginning that they are going to enforce the rules and control them, and then they do so in a manner that's completely ineffective. And I thought last night, her tone when she was interjecting to say you are out of time, it's the difference between when you and I see Steele's dog over his shoulder there. It's the difference between you call your dog and you're like, oh, dog, like come over here, versus like, dog, get over here. And the latter is the one that your dog responds to. And I thought moderator Page last night was too much in that other gear of like, oh, please guys, let's like, I didn't think it was effective, and it became frustrating as a viewer.
Yeah, I love Susan Page. I love her books. She's a delightful person. She's kind of a green room buddy. I really could have used a couple of follow-up questions on some of this stuff, particularly when they kind of filibustered and went back to a previous answer or didn't answer the question that she asked. When Vice President didn't commit to a peaceful transfer of power explicitly, that was just kind of screaming for a follow-up question.
Yep.
So I think that there were areas there. I think she also burned a couple of questions. Like no one was going to give an honest and illuminating answer to the, your running mate is old. Have you had conversations about them becoming incapacitated? That's not going to yield an illuminating answer. I just don't see a way that goes well. So, I think that no one deserves the level of vitriol you get on Twitter after doing a high-profile thing like this. But
I honestly don't know why they sign up for this opportunity. I mean, I get it. It can lead to exposure and stuff, but it's got to be a miserable 90 minutes for those moderators.
Yep.
Great. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll discuss a little bit more about where this race is going from here. I think we'll see a lot more surprises before Election Day, but you're listening to HPS Insights. We'll be right back.
Have you heard the news? HPS Insights is expanding into the HPS podcast channel, which offers our listeners access to all of Hamilton Place Strategy's podcast shows in one convenient place. The HPS podcast channel is home to all of our new and past podcast episodes on your favorite podcast streaming services: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google, and more. If you aren't yet subscribed to the HPS podcast channel, subscribe now to have the latest from HPS Insights and weekly HPS Macrocast episodes delivered straight to your podcast streaming service. To learn more about our podcasts and other original content, visit hamiltonplacestrategies.com/insights.
We're back on HPS Insights. We've covered the highlights of last night's vice presidential debate. But before we move on to the remaining debates, Steele, I wanted to take a minute and talk to you. You were the press secretary for vice presidential candidate Paul Ryan. You've been behind the stage. You've been in these debate preps. I think Washington loves hearing about who the stand-in is and how the practice went. I know Mayor Pete helped Harris prepare for Pence, and I think Pence used a few different people: Scott Walker, Pam Bondi, Sarah Sanders. How helpful is that prep? Or maybe a better question, how accurate do those mock debates end up being in preparing the candidate?
Well, if you're doing your job well, they're extremely helpful and extremely accurate. I mean, you really start this process, the very specific process for doing it as a vice presidential candidate. And it starts with sitting around a hotel room or on a Zoom, presumably this year, going through issue by issue where the vice presidential nominee's record differs from the presidential nominee, and explaining to the vice presidential nominee that their position is now that of the presidential nominee.
Things have changed.
And that was Tucker talked about this earlier. There are some pretty big differences between Senator Harris's positions and former Vice President Biden's. And so there were some bigger jumps there. You then start crafting answers on the individual topics. And the way we looked at it is every answer, 90 seconds, whatever the allotted time is, you want to connect with the audience, you want to explain your position, and you want to contrast your opponent's position. And so as you build out a book, a literal binder, the woman in charge of the binder in our campaign was Elise Stefanik, who's now a congresswoman from upstate New York. Mm-hmm. And as the candidate gets comfortable with those answers, flipping through the book on plane rides, things like that, then you start moving into live fire, variations on the questions, and you eventually build. This takes a lot of time, right? We did a full week in Bend, Oregon, doing pretty much just debate prep. Another 3 or 4 days in Wintergreen, West Virginia, with a full-scale mock-up of as close as we could get to what the commission debate stage was going to look like.
When is that happening, Steele? Is that a week before? Is that months before?
You start months before, if you've got, if you know who your vice presidential nominee is. And you want to peak at the right time. So I think the Wintergreen run-throughs were about a week before the actual debate. And then we traveled to the debate site a couple of days early, so we could get kind of on the right time zone, get a little sun. We had Ted Olson, the former Solicitor General, was our Biden stand-in. He did an extraordinary amount of research. We actually had I still owe him $100 because he was convinced that any question on judges, Biden's answer was going to include a reference to former nominee Robert Bork, kind of the defining moment of Biden's judiciary chairmanship.
Yes.
And his 1988 presidential run was his opposition to Robert Bork as a Supreme Court justice. And every single time Olson would bring it up in his answer as Biden, and every single time we would kind of laugh at him. And then when we got to the actual debate, of course, Biden brought up Bork. But so that's kind of the process of building it up. And if you want to do, ultimately the last couple run throughs, you want it to be full length. You want to do it at the same time of day, just so that the body feels like what it feels to be under those lights for 90 minutes. It wasn't a problem, but it's 90 minutes with no restroom break. When we were preparing Paul, he's a very fit guy. He hydrates incessantly. He tends to use the restroom about once an hour. And so we were concerned that, 90-minute debate, was this going to be a problem? And so basically kept him away from water throughout the day of the debate. So when he got on the debate stage, he started guzzling the bottled water that was under the table, to the extent that when the Saturday Night Live parody the next weekend came out, it had him like a guinea pig with the water bottle, because that was the most kind of memorable thing they could criticize him for, because it was a pretty good debate.
Steele, do you think the debate prep process is any different for Trump than what you just outlined?
Oh God, yes. Yeah, I mean, look,
is there a process?
Apparently just, it's sitting around at Bedminster eating cheeseburgers with Chris Christie and Giuliani, and, people riffing and throwing lines off and all that. I mean, I expect Pence went through something very similar to what I just described. I mean, he was prepared for that debate in a way that suggests to me that he spent an awful lot of time preparing.
Thanks, Steele. But before I let both of you go, I want to ask a little bit of a preview of what we can expect in the final few weeks. Maybe we all need to expect the unexpected. There's news breaking this morning, as I mentioned, that the next debate may be virtual. It may not happen at all, as Trump is saying, at least now, that he will not attend and will hold a rally instead. Do you all think we'll see a couple more debates or one more debate? Do we need another debate to help voters? Tucker, why don't I start with you?
I do think we'll see at least another debate. I think Trump needs the debate more than Biden does, certainly if you believe the polls. The unique thing about this one is about 6% of voters at this point are undecided or are considering themselves, voting for a third party candidate. That's a really low number. Another number that sticks out to me is that, so in 2016, Trump won the group of voters who dislike both candidates by 17%. Well, Biden has consistently led that group and at times has done so by almost 20%. So
Right.
I do think that Trump is it's hard to imagine what a more aggressive Trump looks like than what he was in debate one. But I think he's going to have to press some issues and further kind of destabilize Biden and get some crossover effect. It's not just the undecideds that he's playing for. He's actually trying to steal some folks that have decided they're going to vote for Biden but have not yet filled out a ballot. He's going to have to get some of that back if you believe the polls. So I think he does need another debate. He doesn't want that debate to be virtual because the president sees himself as a television performer and believes that his in the room presence will contribute to his ability to destabilize Biden in the moment, and probably feels as though Biden over a Zoom call is a more controlled environment with handlers around him that are able to help him manage through the environment in a way that doesn't happen on a live stage.
Yeah, we talked about this last time a little bit, Steele, that part of Trump's strategy would be to get Biden to make a gaffe or slip up a little bit, which I agree with Tucker is virtually impossible if Biden's sitting in Delaware surrounded by his aides. But Steele, what do you think? Do we see another debate before the election?
Yeah, I mean, God knows we don't need another presidential debate like the last presidential debate. But I think you're exactly right. I think that the president's strategy, to the extent that he has one at this point, is heavily dependent on some moment where the former vice president seems senile, seems out of it. And the only way he gets that kind of exposure is by agreeing to additional debate. So it's in the president's political interest to have it happen. And so I assume it will.
Great. Well, I appreciate both of you joining us today. I hope, or at least our plan, is to do one of these after each debate. So if another one happens, you'll hear from us again at HPS Insights. Thank you all for tuning in. Again, special thanks to Steele and Tucker. Appreciate their insights this morning. You can find out more about Hamilton Place Strategies work and our podcast at hamiltonplacestrategies.com or by following us on Twitter at HPS Insight. I'm Brian DeAngelis. As always, thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening to the HPS Insights podcast, produced by Hamilton Place Strategies. For the latest updates, follow us on Twitter at HPS Insight and visit us on the web at hamiltonplacestrategies.com.